This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. The marathon has a special place in Olympics tradition. As one of the last events of each Summer Games, the race leaves spectators and athletes with a lasting impression, a memory to cherish, and a story to share for generations to come. Well, in 1904, St. Louis made its mark on Olympic history as part of the World's Fair. But it's the sort of footnote that reads more like a description of a Looney Tunes episode or a Saturday Night Live skit than some tale of proud glory. Adam Kloppe is public historian at the Missouri Historical Society. He's here to get into that footnote with us today. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start first with some context. So as we know them today, the Olympics are a major thing, a grandiose global event that captures much of the world's attention. But that wasn't always the case. So despite St. Louis being the first American city to have an Olympic Games, it wasn't such a big deal back at the turn of the 20th century, right, Adam?
Yeah, St. Louis, was hosting the 1904 Olympics, but funnily enough, they weren't supposed to host those games at all, right? 1904, it was going to be the third modern Olympiad. It had been Athens and then Paris, and then the Olympic Committee knew that they wanted these games to be in the U.S. because the U.S. is sports crazy, and the first two games hadn't gone that well. So let's get these games to the U.S. so that sports crazy Americans can help boost these games. So a bunch of cities put in bids to get the Olympics, and Chicago actually ends up winning the bid for the 1904 Olympics. St. Louis loses. And the World's Fair is supposed to happen in 1903. So the World's Fair gets delayed for several reasons, construction delays, securing participation, stuff like that. And, once the fair gets delayed until 1904, the fair committee essentially writes to the Olympic Committee and says, hey, your first two Olympics didn't go so well. You want to make sure these are a big success. We're going to have our own international athletic competition in St. Louis, and we guarantee you it's going to be bigger than your little Olympic Games. So you might want to rethink where you're going to have these. So the Olympics actually agrees and moves the games to St. Louis. Like, that's how sort of not a big deal the Olympics were at the time. That, just that one little bit of pressure can make them say, okay, we need to rethink this whole thing. So they end up moving the games to St. Louis.
And so the 1904 Olympic Games, there were debuts of different things. In 2024, the Olympic Games, the Summer Games that just passed, we saw new sports like breakdancing, skateboarding, sport climbing, and surfing. What were some of the unique competitions that the 1904 St. Louis Games brought to the world?
Right. So the most unique event that made its debut at the 1904 Games was an event called the Plunge for Distance. It was a diving event. And instead of, diving off a high board and doing some sort of athletic or acrobatic thing, instead you would stand on a platform that was basically right at water level. And the athlete would dive into the water and basically see how far he could get from the platform he dove off of without moving at all.
So like standing long jump, but in the water.
But in the water. And you had 60 seconds to be underwater or whenever you came up for breath. That was when, your try ended, but you couldn't move or anything. You couldn't kick your feet or move your arms or anything. So it was just dive in, see how far you can get, and then pop up. And whoever did that won. Doesn't sound like the most athletic thing in the world, right? There's a reason that 1904 is the only Olympics that has that. There's also sports at those games like the tug of war. That was an Olympic sport from 1900 until 1920. So it didn't debut in St. Louis and didn't end in St. Louis.
Sure.
But it is an event that when you hear of it, you're like, tug of war was an Olympic sport? But it was here. And at the History Museum, we actually have the silver medal from the 1904 tug of war event in our collections. It's on display in our World's Fair exhibit.
So the reason we have brought you here has to do with a marathon. The marathon is one of the premier events of the modern Olympic Games, both for men and women. And in 1904, there was no women's marathon, but the men's marathon is infamous as a literal hot mess. So Adam, what was it that objectively made that Olympic marathon the worst in Olympics history?
Well, in 1904, just like today, the the marathon was, the signature event of these Olympics, right? The president of the World's Fair was there to fire off the starting pistol. And the president's daughter, Alice Roosevelt, was there to give a laurel to the winner. Like, it was a big deal for the World's Fair and for these Olympics. But very quickly, it came across how poorly organized this event was. After the athletes completed several laps at Francis Field, which is, the facility at WashU there, the marathon course took them out onto roads in St. Louis County. Those roads were unpaved, and they were not closed to traffic. Mm-hmm. So, it's August, it's St. Louis, it's really hot, there's cars, there's horses and buggies, there's people kicking up dust. So several of the runners end up being hospitalized because they had breathed in so much dust during the course of the event.
Right.
And they really didn't have good ways to get that dust out of their throats either. The people who organized the marathon, they also thought of themselves sort of as scientists, and they only set up 2 water stations for the entirety of the Olympic marathon course. So imagine that, running 20 plus miles in St. Louis August heat. You only get 2 drinks of water the whole time. Mm-hmm. Most of the athletes end up dropping out of the event, quitting in the middle. There's a few that cheat. They get rides in cars and stuff and try to get there. The guy who ends up winning the marathon, his trainers who are following him in a car, at one point he's hallucinating. He's near the end of the race, but he thinks he just started. He's like not doing well. So they give him a mixture of egg whites, strychnine, and brandy just to give him some calories and get his muscles firing again so that he'll finish the race.
And strychnine is commonly known as rat poison,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So it's their version of unfederally regulated and checked Red Bull.
Right. Yeah, kind of. It was just a way to let's see if we can get his muscles sort of moving again. But he's the guy that ends up winning. So yeah, it was a big mess of an event.
Mm-hmm. And there were runners who also stopped to take naps, got food poisoning from fruit.
Yeah, there was a guy who went to sleep in an apple orchard after he had eaten some rotten apples off the ground and ended up with, really bad stomach pains and all that stuff. There was one runner that showed up and he was wearing essentially street clothes and, street shoes, and other runners had to cut his pants into shorts and give him running shoes and stuff. It was a much different kind of event than it would be today.
And to the point that you'd made about scientists, the runners were also test subjects, and there were only 2 water stations that you've mentioned. I mean, what in the Sam Hill was the purpose of that? And what did it maybe reflect about other parts of the 1904 Olympic Games, which was part of the World's Fair?
Yeah, I think part of the World's Fair was that they were trying to, demonstrate the latest and greatest in, European scientific theories about all sorts of things. And in the early 20th century, of course, there's a lot of theories about new theories about how bodies work. There's theories about race science and things like that, too. Mm-hmm. As a companion to the Olympic Games, they actually sponsored an event called the Anthropology Days. As part of the World's Fair, there were over 1,000 people that were brought to St. Louis from the Philippines who had their lives and bodies put on display, essentially for the amusement of fairgoers. And there were colonized and indigenous peoples here from all over the world who were on display. And the Anthropology Days was sort of a companion to the Olympics, where some of those colonized peoples were made to compete in Western-style Olympic sports and then had their results compared against Olympic athletes, white Olympic athletes. And then that evidence, quote unquote evidence, was used as, support for theories about racial hierarchies and things that were in vogue in a lot of scientific circles at the time. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's incredibly racist, and led to a lot of very incorrect thinking about different peoples from around the world. And so, that's an important part of that Olympic legacy, though, in St. Louis, is to try to wrestle with that while we're also talking about things like the marathon and, the plunge for distance and some of these, more jovial kinds of stories that we can look back and laugh a little bit, right? We have to wrestle with some of that harder history, too.
Mm-hmm. So was there any way in which those 1904 Olympic Games set a precedent for what we absolutely are not going to do in the future?
I mean, I think so, right? I think there was, the Olympic organizers certainly weren't happy with these games because of things like the Anthropology Days. St. Louis was also really hard to get to at the time. Only 650 athletes competed in these games. Over 90% of the athletes there were American, because it was just such a hard place to get to from Europe and other places. It's a boat and then a train or another boat. It just took weeks and weeks to get here. So I think that there was a little bit more emphasis put on putting the games in, easier places to get to. just sort of better organizing these games for the athletes and for their performance. But it's also a games where there are things that are introduced that are still part of the Olympics today. It's the first Olympics with boxing. It's the first Olympics with freestyle wrestling. It's the first Olympics with gold, silver, and bronze medals given out to the athletes. So it also holds an important place in Olympic history too.
And as we wrap sort of on this more positive note of other firsts, it was also the first games where an African-American athlete finished on the podium, isn't it?
Yeah. So there was an athlete here named George Pogue. He competed in 2 hurdles events. He was a member of the Milwaukee Athletic Club, so he's an American athlete. And he came here and he competed in those 2 events, got bronze medals in both. And then after the games, he actually stayed in St. Louis and taught at Sumner High School for a few years. So there's an Olympic legacy that lasts in St. Louis for years after these games.
So last question. When you watch the Olympics, how much of this is going through your mind as a spectator, you're taking things in through the television?
Yeah. It does go through my mind a lot, right? You mentioned the breakdancing event before, and I know that there was a lot of, furor about that online. Some people saying that it shouldn't have been an Olympic sport or, maybe it wasn't represented correctly and stuff. And those are the same kind of debates people were having about games in 1904. So, there's certainly precedent for that kind of controversial side of new sports in the Olympics.
Adam Kloppe is public historian at the Missouri Historical Society. Adam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.